corruption skyrockets. During your confirmation hearing, I asked you about your many potential conflicts of interest as a former lobbyist. You responded under oath, quote, "You will consult with career ethics officials within the department and make the appropriate decision," end of quote. But the Justice Department then removed those career ethics officials and put in their place inexperienced political appointees beholden to President and you. And you've effectively shut down the Office of Professional Responsibility, which investigates misconduct by Department of Justice attorneys. Now, with these ethical guardrails out of the way, corruption has run rampant at the Department of Justice. Although you've been a registered foreign agent for Qatar, you did not recuse yourself from signing off on President Trump's solicitation of a free jet from the royal family, even though this gift was clearly illegal.
What Senator Dick Durbin just did to Attorney General Pam Bondi in this opening statement was not subtle, not polite, and definitely not accidental. This was a full-on indictment of what Durbin is arguing the Department of Justice has become under President Donald Trump.
Connections to Attorney General Bondi seem to yield more favorable outcomes for defendants. At least 2 long-running federal prosecutions were abruptly dropped after the defendants hired your brother. It's no surprise that Ed Morton, the failed U.S. Attorney nominee you appointed as senior official, said, quote, "No MAGA left behind." Our nation's top law enforcement agency has become a shield for the president and his political allies when they engage in misconduct. Last year, President Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, was allegedly recorded accepting a $50,000 bag of cash in exchange for promising immigration enforcement-related contracts. Under your leadership, the investigation into Mr. Homan was dropped. After President Trump pardoned nearly 1,600 January 6 insurrectionists, including more than 600 charged with assaulting or impeding law enforcement, the Department of Justice is arguing in court that these pardons provide immunity for wholly unrelated crimes in multiple cases. Jared Weiss was filmed on January 6th, encouraging his fellow rioters to attack the Metropolitan Police Department officers. And he said, "F them, kill them." What happened to Mr. Weiss? He's been hired by you as a senior advisor. In February, you said the Epstein client list was, quote, "sitting on my desk right now for review." 8 months later, you still haven't produced these files, and a credible whistleblower told my office that FBI agents were directed to flag any records in which President Trump was mentioned. The Department of Justice ordered the dismissal of corruption charges against the former New York City Mayor Eric Adams in a corrupt backroom deal to secure his cooperation with the president's immigration agenda. Acting U.S. Attorney Daniel Sassoon, a Republican appointed by President Trump, resigned in protest. Acting U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Eric Siebert, a Republican appointed by President Trump, was forced to resign because he didn't believe there was sufficient evidence to indict New York Attorney General Letitia Adams or former FBI Director James Comey. In his place, President Trump installed his former personal attorney, someone with no prosecutorial experience, to indict Director Comey, which she did. She joins a network of unqualified MAGA loyalists masquerading as federal prosecutors, like Alina Habba, who said she would use her position to, quote, "turn New Jersey red," close quote, and Sigal Chattah, who once said that a black political opponent was, quote, "should be hanging from an effing crane," end of quote. The president and attorney general attempted to bypass the Senate to install these unqualified extremists. Where do you find these people? Courts have ruled that both Ms. Habba and Ms. Chattah are serving in their roles illegally, jeopardizing countless prosecutions by your office. Why? And that's just one example of how the Department of Justice is making America less safe. Attorney General Bondi shut down the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force, OSADEF, which has dismantled thousands of criminal organizations. And you diverted thousands of FBI, DEA, and ATF agents and DOJ prosecutors from their critical missions to carry out the president's mass deportation agenda. Attorney General Bondi, not surprisingly, federal drug prosecutions have dropped to the lowest level in decades. Let me repeat that. Federal prosecutions for drug crimes have dropped to the lowest level in decades on your watch. Department of Justice has also unilaterally terminated 373 grants that provide critical funding to state and local law enforcement to the tune of $500 million. The 2026 Trump budget would slash the high-intensity drug trafficking areas program known as HIDA by more than a third, from $300 million to $196 million. Instead of taking common-sense steps that have proven to help reduce crime, Attorney General, you're focusing on helping President Trump play strongman on television. He has illegally deployed troops to Chicago and other American citizens and has threatened to send more. The Justice Department defends this dubious legal basis for these deployments and diverts DOJ personnel and their components to assist in these efforts. These deployments basically target Democratic-run cities and Democratic leaders, ignoring many Republican-led areas of our country with even higher crime rates, and making clear that this is for political theater, not public safety. One particular chaotic raid in Chicago Tuesday last week, aided by the FBI and ATF, which you supervise. In the middle of the night, federal agents pulled women and children out of their beds, crashed down the doors to their homes, destroyed their apartments, zip-tied children and others, and detained immigrants and U.S. citizens alike for hours in vans. When one witness complained about the treatment of the small children, an agent laughed at her and said, "F them kids." On Friday, a federal judge appointed by President Trump held that deploying the National Guard in Portland is illegal. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller accused her of, quote, legal insurrection, close quote. At a time of rising threats to federal judges, this kind of language is inexcusable. Last week, the President and Secretary Hegseth summoned senior military officials to a political pep rally at Quantico, where the President said he wanted to use American cities as, quote, training grounds for our military. Training grounds for our military. To fight the, quote, enemy within. Chicago is not the enemy. Our fellow Americans are not the enemy. It is abhorrent for the President, who is supposed to represent all Americans regardless of political party, to describe anyone who disagrees with him in this manner. To my Republican colleagues who claim the previous administration weaponized the Department of Justice, President Biden retained President Trump's FBI Director Christopher Wray, who President Trump then fired. President Biden never directed the Attorney General to prosecute his political opponents. President Biden never fired his own political appointees for refusing to prosecute his targets. What has taken place since January 20th, 2025 would make even President Nixon recoil. This is your legacy, Attorney General Bondi. In 8 short months, you have fundamentally transformed the Justice Department and left an enormous stain in American history. It will take decades to recover. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
When Senator Dick Durbin finished speaking, the room didn't just hear an opening statement. It heard a verdict in progress. What Durbin laid out wasn't a single scandal, or a one-off abuse of power, or even a partisan disagreement dressed up as outrage. It was a portrait of systemic decay. A warning that the slow, quiet dismantling of institutional norms can be far more dangerous than any single dramatic act, because by the time people realize what's happened, the damage is already baked in. And that's the most unsettling part of all of this. The Department of Justice is not supposed to feel personal. It's not supposed to feel political. It's supposed to be dull, procedural, and relentlessly boring in the way it applies the law. The moment it becomes animated by loyalty, resentment, revenge, or ideology, it stops being a Justice Department and starts becoming something else entirely. Durbin is arguing that we are watching that transformation in real time. Not with one massive authoritarian move, but with 1,000 small decisions that all point in the same direction. Career officials pushed out, oversight offices hollowed out, prosecutors punished for restraint instead of rewarded for independence, ethical barriers removed and replaced with political allegiance, each step defensible on paper, each step corrosive in reality. And the tragedy is that these systems were designed specifically to resist this kind of capture. They were built after past abuses, after Watergate, after COINTLPRO, after moments when the country collectively decided that no president, no party, no ideology should ever fully control the machinery of justice. That's why the Nixon comparison hits so hard. Because Nixon didn't fail because he was uniquely evil. He failed because he believed the Justice Department belonged to him, because he believed enemies were more important than laws, because he treated accountability as an obstacle instead of a safeguard. Durbin's message is chillingly simple. What once ended a presidency is now being normalized. And normalization is the real danger. When courts ruling against the government are framed as insurrection. When judges doing their jobs are portrayed as enemies. When federal agents are redirected from fighting organized crime to performing mass political theater. When pardons are stretched so far they begin to resemble immunity for loyalty. When prosecutors resign in protest and are replaced with people whose primary qualification is obedience. At some point, the question stops being, is this legal? And becomes, what kind of country does this create? Durbin's focus on cities like Chicago is key here, because cities are where federal power is felt most directly. Not in press releases, not in talking points, but in midnight raids, in broken doors, in terrified children, in communities learning very quickly that they are being treated not as citizens, but as problems to be managed. That's how alienation begins. And when the President of the United States talks about American cities as training grounds and fellow Americans as the enemy within, that language doesn't just shock, it conditions. It tells people with power that cruelty is justified, that restraint is weakness, and that dissent is danger. History shows us where that road leads. Not immediately, not overnight, but steadily, relentlessly, with institutions that still look intact from the outside while being hollowed out from within. What makes Durbin's statement so powerful is that it isn't theoretical. It's built on resignations, on court rulings, on dropped cases, on dismantled task forces, on real-world consequences that don't disappear when the news cycle moves on. Because trust, once lost, is almost impossible to restore. Trust that prosecutors are acting in good faith. Trust that investigations aren't politically filtered. Trust that law enforcement isn't being selectively unleashed. Trust that justice doesn't depend on your politics, your proximity to power, or your usefulness to those at the top. Durbin is saying that trust is bleeding out, and that the longer it's ignored, the harder it will be to save. And maybe the most sobering part of all of this is who is sounding the alarm. Not activists, not cable news hosts, but judges appointed by both parties, Republican prosecutors, career officials who chose resignation over complicity, people who believed in the system enough to walk away when it stopped resembling what they swore to uphold. That should worry everyone, regardless of ideology. Because when institutionalists start leaving en masse, it's a sign that something fundamental has shifted. This wasn't about embarrassing Attorney General Pam Bondi for a viral clip, and it wasn't really about President Donald Trump as a personality. It was about power, how it's used, how it's restrained, and what happens when the restraints are treated as inconveniences instead of necessities. Durbin put a marker down in the historical record. He said, "This is the moment we noticed. Whether anything changes from here is an open question. But what can't be said anymore is that no one warned us." Because warnings were given, in detail, on the record, without ambiguity. And years from now, when people ask how the Justice Department lost its independence, this speech will be part of the answer. Not because it stopped what was happening, but because it documented it while there was still time to care. That's why this moment matters. And that's why it shouldn't be forgotten. If you want more long-form breakdowns like this, calm, detailed, and focused on what actually matters, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. This conversation isn't over. It's just getting started.